Okay, so we're going to look, we're really focusing here on Tecumseh today, but I want to put this in the context of the greater resistance to the loss of land that the Native Americans worked towards. So throughout, from the earliest days, there had been various forms of resistance, and in some cases, working together in peace. And so I want to kind of put the Tecumseh fighting, the Tecumseh-led fighting that happens during the War of 1812 in the context of kind of prior resistance that has happened throughout um, North American contact with Native Americans, European contact with Native Americans in North America. So we'll begin by looking at the Powhatan village and the Powhatan Confederacy that is made up, that is the first major contact between the English and the the Native Americans of North America. Obviously, there's been other contact. I shouldn't say first major contact, but the first permanent English colony starts off in Jamestown, Virginia. And so the Powhatan are English, Algonquin-speaking Indians, and almost immediately, it's a very difficult relationship between the two sides. The Powhatan decide that they're not really so sure if they want these people here, and so in 1609 they start what's known as the starving time. The Powhatan surround the village basically and kind of set up a siege of the village or of that area, not just around the village, but just kind of around their fort and their general area. So if the colonists strayed out too far, they were in grave danger. And so this leads to what's known as the starving time, among other problems. But that was a big problem for the colonists, is that they were in danger. But what really brings that period to a close is, referred to here as the Peace of Pocahontas. Basically, when Pocahontas and John Rolfe marry, who was an English colonist, when they marry, that brings about kind of a de facto peace treaty. It's not an actual peace treaty that's signed, but by having that marriage, peace is brought forward. But of course, as you may know, Pocahontas doesn't live. She doesn't. She dies fairly soon after their marriage, and so she only lives a few years later, and so that doesn't hold. And so by 1622, there is another war basically breaks out, and during this time, more than 300 colonists, or nearly a third of the population, are killed in the space of just a few hours. There's a kind of a concerted effort to attack several different kind of expanding outposts that have happened. Tobacco has improved the economy. The colonists have a greater need for land, and so they've been pushing further and further away from the coast, further inland along the river, and that is taking away Indian lands. And the same old story. The colonists' desire for land brings conflict with Native Americans, and Native Americans decide, okay, this is enough. We're not going to take any more, and there's fighting. And there's a concerted effort, and this war goes on basically for 10 years, and eventually the colonists continue to survive, and eventually the war ends, and they continue to grow. The Native Americans continue to kind of end up being pushed back, and by 1644, the third Anglo-Powhatan War begins, and this is really just their last effort to dislodge the English colonists. By this time, the colonists have grown significantly, and this is their last chance to really get rid of them. Well, it's not successful, and Jamestown and Virginia continues to grow. Tobacco continues to be the major crop, and therefore there's a ever-growing need for land. Which brings us to the next big colony that the English set up in the New World, and that is the Plymouth colony. And there is where the Pilgrims, as we refer to them today, meet Massasoit and the Pokanoket people. And the Pokanoket people have been seriously weakened by disease. before the English arrive, as we've talked about in the past, these different New England tribes had quite a bit of contact with English fishermen and traders, and so the Pokanoket have, just prior to this, been seriously weakened by disease. As I said, they contracted. We're not sure what disease, but a disease that really weakened them and made them really susceptible to their enemies, the Narragansetts. The Narragansett hadn't faced this kind of disease, and so the Narragansett are still powerful, still at full strength. The Pokanoket have been weakened, and so therefore these English colonists show up and they try to decide what are we going to do about them. And they eventually decide, hey, our best route, our best option is to kind of become an ally with the English so that they can help us against the Narragansetts. And so and this is successful. Massasoit and the Pokanoket, or the Wampanoag Confederacy, are strengthened by the presence of the Pilgrims, and they kind of work together. And that peace is going to last for basically until Massasoit dies. And then we're going to see in the next slides what happens when his son comes into power. So Massasoit's son is a Metacomet, or Metacom, as sometimes he's referred to. He was called by the English King Philip because he actually, and that wasn't like a name they made up, he actually takes that name. He is the son of Massasoit, so he forms an Indian alliance. The Indians have continued to kind of lose territory, and there's been some continued expansion by the English, and so there's mounting pressure on the Pokanoket tribes, the Wampanoag Confederacy, and surrounding tribes as well. And during this time, the English have grown, and so King Philip is able to form an alliance, and they have a coordinated attack on English settlements. And during this time, 12 English towns are completely destroyed. Estimated 5% of New England colonists are killed, which is more people, a higher percentage than even during like World War II. So we're talking about a huge percent of the New England colony is killed. But which sounds big, and it is, but when you compare it to the Native American losses, it's not nearly as significant. Now, the Native population is reduced by half in the region. Not many of them aren't necessarily killed. There's at least 3,000 killed, which is a significant portion of their population. But others, after this loss, end up moving. During this time, some are captured and sent and sold into slavery, and so there are a variety of different reasons why this native population is reduced. But this was their last opportunity to stop the growth of the English colonies, and it's not successful. It actually has the exact opposite effect. The English will, from this point, have a solid hold in New England, and these native populations are basically wiped out. There's some survivors, and they have smaller and smaller pieces of land, and some move further west into areas of New York. But they've got enemies there, and so they're not necessarily always welcomed. Which brings us to Tecumseh now. So this is a kind of a series of attempts by groups to form alliances, and this is one of the big problems, is that the Native Americans have smaller communities, smaller tribes. Sometimes they have larger confederacies, but they're dealing with a larger population, the English population, that is commanded by one person, the king, and so that causes them difficulty because they're more fractured, and they're having to deal with a more unified response. And so Tecumseh sees this, and he realizes that the Indians need to fight and work together if they're going to have any chance of stopping the continued move of now no longer the English, but the Americans now. And so as a young warrior, he saw defeat at Fallen Timbers. This was in the Ohio River Valley area, and he saw that this is where the Shawnee lost their homeland in Ohio. He refuses to sign the treaty, but others do not. And he really starts to speak out, not just against the encroachments of the white settlers, but really against the native leaders who sell land to the white settlers. What he is trying to do is develop a pan-tribal alliance, so alliance with all the tribes that are basically in this region, what we would call the Northwest Territory, and really everything west of those first 13 colonies or so, that region. So west of Georgia and west of South Carolina, west of Virginia, all the way up west of in the Ohio River Valley, all this area in Indiana. And he's moderately successful. He's able to get many different tribes together, along with his brother. His brother is seen as more of a spiritual guide and leader, and Tecumseh is the warrior. And there's a large group that's at a town basically called Prophetstown. And while Tecumseh is further south, trying to gain more alliances with people further south, Prophetstown is, William Henry Harrison marches his soldiers to Prophetstown. And so the prophet, that's Tecumseh's brother, sees this, and he decides, hey, we're going to surprise attack them in the middle of the night. The plan almost works, but as daylight breaks, the numbers, the American army numbers are much larger, and so therefore they are successful at kind of fighting back that attack, and then it's a massive defeat and massacre after that with the loss at Prophetstown. And so this really breaks any idea, any hope of having a really large alliance. This defeat is crushing. Now it doesn't stop Tecumseh and others. They continue to fight, but now they're going to be they're not going to have the power they did, and they're going to be fighting alongside the British during the War of 1812. And so Tecumseh does. He continues to fight along with many other Indians, but this large alliance that they were hoping to form does not come to fruition. And as I said, Tecumseh joins in with the British to fight the Americans in the War of 1812. His leadership and bravery is admired by all. I mean, leader after leader talked about Tecumseh being just a brave person, but also a genius of a leader, that he could, that he just made sense and people would follow him. But unfortunately for his movement, he is killed in the Battle of the Thames, and so the same story for Native Americans continues. Loss of land, loss of life, loss of a way of life, and so Tecumseh is ultimately unsuccessful in bringing about an alliance between the Native Americans that would be able to actually stand against the Americans, or as in years past, the English. And so that is kind of a quick overview of some of the major resistance movements that took place during the early days of colonies and leading up to the early days of the American Republic.